So, to return to the starting point of this digression, in respect to the question of realism in science, Lacan's diagnosis could be summed up in the following way. Although it may well be that naive realism constitutes the spontaneous ideology of many scientists, it is utterly irrelevant for the constitution of the scientific discourse, its efficiency and its mode of operation. As we've seen, this means modern science did not arrive to the absolute character of its referent by relying on the presuppositions of naive realism, by naively assuming the existence of its referent in nature, but precisely by reducing it to a letter or a number, whatever, which only opens the space of real consequences of scientific discourse, also for nature, of course. And the word reducing to the letter is not to be taken in the sense of reducing the richness of sensible qualities to an absolute minimum, yet a minimum in which we would be dealing with a continuum of the same substance, so to say. It should be taken in the sense of a cut and of substitution. It's not, you know, Kant has this beautiful metaphor at some point that some people they want to make the step from the material to the spiritual, and then they represent to themselves a material so very tiny, tiny that it's all of a sudden spiritualized. So it's not this kind of the continuum. There is a certain cut and a break precisely in this kind of presupposed continuity. And what is at stake is also not the classical logic of representation, of course. The latter, scientific formulas, doesn't represent some aspect of sensible nature, but literally replaces it. Replaces it with something that belongs to the discourse, to the semblance, if you want, yet something that can be, precisely because it belongs to the discourse, handled in a way that produces, touches whatever, something real. So which brings us again to the point formulated earlier and repeated by Lacan several times. It is not worth talking of anything else but the real in which discourse itself has consequences. So this is not an argument about the real being only the effect of discourse. The link between discursivity and real is here, I think, finds here a much firmer foundation than in the case of simply stating the referent as natural object in that this referent is absolute in some of its aspects at least. And I think, now of course I'm referring to Meillassoux, I think that precisely what he misses is that he doesn't see the mathematization of science as this cut into reality that only produces the dimension of the real, but he kind of pictures this at the farthest extreme point of a continuum of continuous sharpening of the scientific form of speech about reality with the purely formal or formalizable segment of a thing remaining in the end in the net of this sharpened scientific form as the only real. And perhaps one could say that in spite of his polemics with Kant, what we get here is a kind of a, let's say, not necessarily the one reading that I would sustain, but a kind of a, what one usually sees as this paradoxical Kantian non-pathological object that corresponds to the pure form of the law, as if it was something that would remain, so some solid outside matter that would remain on the net of the pure formality of the law. So if, just to recall this quote that I already read, the reference of the statements about the dates, volumes, etc. existed 4.5 billion years ago as described by these statements, but not the statements themselves, this scientific net, which is contemporary with us. So we could say that scientific formula in its ideal character catches in its net here and now a fragment of the thing that is in itself absolute, that existed as such 4.5 billion years ago. Or put it another way, the real is that portion of substance that doesn't slide through the net of mathematizable science, but remains in it. And Lacan's metaphor, and with it the entire perspective, is indeed quite different in this respect. For him, the real is not guaranteed by numbers or letters in their consistency, but precisely by the impossible, that is, by the limit of their consistency. This is the constant that he is coming to. This is why science doesn't operate by catching in its net the real as an absolute object, but touches upon the real by way, so to say, the holes in its net coincide with the holes in the real, or something like this. It is not worth talking about the real of the nature beyond discourse if it's not worth talking about it. The reason is that here we necessarily stay on the level of semblance, which means that we can say whatever we like. And to a certain extent, Meillassoux would agree with this. But the real, on the other hand, for Lacan, is indicated precisely by the fact that not all is possible. And here, of course, enters the other crucial component of Lacan's real, binding the realism of consequences to the modality of the impossible. And together they could be articulated perhaps as follows. Something has consequences if it cannot be anything, or if it is impossible in one of its segments. But I won't go into this question of the impossible today. I will go a little bit into it with some further examples tomorrow. I will just now read you a quote from Lacan that kind of suggests this metaphor that I was just describing, with this inconsistency and limit of consistency as being the real and not the letter itself. This is again from D'un discours qui ne serait pas dissemblant. The articulation, and I mean algebraic articulation of the semblance, which as such only involves letters, and its effects. This is the only apparatus by means of which we designate what is real. What is real is what makes or constitutes a whole in this semblance, ce qui fait trou in this semblance. In this articulated semblance that is scientific discourse. The scientific discourse advances without ever worrying whether it is a semblance or not. What is at stake is simply that its network, its net, its lattice, as one says, makes the right holes appear in the right place. It has no other reference but the impossible to which its deductions arrive. This impossible is the real. In physics, we only aim at something which is the real by means of discursive apparatus, so far as the latter, in its own rigor, encounters the limits of its consistency. And then he adds in another paragraph, but what interests us, psychoanalysts, is the field of truth. So, just to recapitulate the essential, let's say, or basic result of the argument that I was making so far. I could say that the subject of the unconscious is the subject of modern science, precisely in the sense that it is essentially linked to the field in which discourse has consequences. And I think, of course, this is also one of the ways how one should understand Lacan's famous statement that the subject is the answer of the real. It is not something that constitutes the real. It is contemporary with the real. They kind of emerge at the same time. It's an answer of the real. It is not simply something that really is not subjectively constituted in this way. So the subject of modern science is the subject of the unconscious is related to the subject of modern science precisely in the sense that they both involve or presuppose this field in which discourse has consequences. Without this, there is no subject, and certainly no subject of the unconscious. And we could perhaps say, if science creates and opens the field in which discourse has consequences in some aspect, not that it's the first time that it happens, but if it does so, psychoanalysis is the science about this singular field precisely, in which this discourse has real consequences, and about how these consequences work also. But before concluding, I think I will like to go a step back so as not to avoid the challenge of Meillassoux' initial question in its estimable directness and simplicity. That is, what does the, let's say, if I formulate it this way, what does the Lacanian realism of consequences combined with the impossible, real as impossible, imply for the status of the so-called ancestral statements or archaefossils? Does the statement, the Earth was formed 4.5 billion years ago, make any sense regardless of us? That is, does it refer to a specific object which has, in fact, although according to our way of counting and based on the radiometric dating, existed 4.5 billion years ago? So I will venture an answer, and an affirmative one at that, although with a kind of twist. But in order to formulate it, I will draw on a very fascinating story which revolves precisely around fossils, and which, I think, if taken in its speculative dimension, can give to the notion of archaefossil a Lacanian turn which is missing in Meillassoux. In his book, Meillassoux does in fact hint at some point to this story, but he really, this remains an absolutely cursory hint, serving only as a rhetorical argument of mocking the absurdities that correlationism would seem to be compatible with, and I think it really misses the true speculative potential of this story, I think, this hint of Meillassoux. So what is the story? In one of his, I think, best essays entitled Adam's Navel, Stephen Jay Gould, the famous biologist, draws our attention to a most astonishing, ridiculous, but also extremely elegant story, or theory, suggested by an important British naturalist, Philip Henry Gosse. Gosse was Darwin's contemporary, and he published the work that interests us here, which is called Omphalos, in 1857. That is only 2 years before Darwin's On the Origin of Species occurred. Gosse was a most passionate naturalist, and one of his greatest passions were fossils, precisely, which he has been studying and describing in all detail with particular devotion. At that time, the nascent science of geology has already gathered evidence for the Earth's enormous antiquity, which bluntly contradicted its age according to the biblical story of Genesis, which is about 6,000 years ago. And this was precisely Gosse's principal dilemma. He was not only a dedicated naturalist, but also a deeply religious man. And the core of his theory consisted in an attempt to resolve the contradiction, the tension, whatever, between the relatively recent creation ab nihilo and the real existence of fossils of a much more respectable age. So he came up with this rather ingenious theory according to which God did indeed create the earth about 6,000 years ago, but he did not create it only for the future, for the time to come, but also retroactively for the past. And at the moment of creation, he also put fossils in it. So he created Earth with the ready-made fossils already in it. And I think one shouldn't miss, of course, already the beauty of this self-effacing gesture in which God creates the world by effacing the traces of his own creation and hence of his own existence, so to say, to the benefit of the scientific exploration. And I think it's probably no coincidence that the theological side rejected this theory even more passionately than the scientific side. Namely, immediately the consensus appeared that God could not have, I quote, written on the rocks one enormous and superfluous lie. And modern American creationists, contrary to what, because Meillassoux is claiming that this is their stance, but I don't know, according to Gould, this is not true at all, that modern American creationists mostly, at least, reject this theory as imputing a dubious moral character to God. So why is he cheating? Why is he doing so? So But I think the interest of ghost theory for our discussion here consists in 2 points, basically. On the one hand, the notion of the archifossil gains in it an additional, I think, surprising but important sense, namely precisely the sense of an always already fossil. And I don't know if I go into this now. I think it's part of the criticism that Meillassoux has already met. His theory went precisely in the sense Peter Howard, for instance, developed this, that actually there is something wrong with this argument. The problem is not things that are older than we. For Kant, this is no problem to think about things that are supposedly appeared before we were there. The point is just that, I will just read you a short quote from Peter Howard's argument. He says, the genuine conquest of the correlationist fortress would require not a reference to objects ordered and taught, but to the processes of thinking that proceed without thinking, or objects that are somehow presentable in the absence of any objective presence or evidence. And I don't know, in my view, this leads directly to psychoanalysis. What is this process of thinking that proceeds without thinking? Then the unconscious, and what are the objects that are somehow presentable in the absence of any objective presence, but this object small a. But also I think it leads precisely to this notion of an always already fossil, not something that it's not a question of this kind of temporality. But perhaps one can make this point more clearly in the relation to the second point, which is that I think the crucial aspect of Gauss's story, it has the merit of pointing to the insufficiency precisely of a simply linear theory of time in respect to the question of the real here. And let's say this patina of bizarreness that surrounds Gauss's story shouldn't blind us for the fact that, structurally speaking, if you look at this, his dilemma, I claim, is exactly Meillassoux' dilemma. It suffices to replace God's creation with human creation or subjective creation, the nature as subjectively, discursively constituted, and we get a very similar question. Does science only study something which we have ourselves constituted as such, posited as external, or is this exteriority independent of us and has existed precisely as such long before us? I really think it's the same kind of question. And I think that the Lacanian answer would be, it is independent, yet it only becomes such in the very precise moment in time, or if you say. This is to say, with the emergence, ex nihilo, why not, of the reality in which discourse has consequences, we get a physical reality independent of ourselves. Which is not to say, of course, that we don't have any influence of it. It's not this kind of independence. So, and of course, we also get it retroactively for the time before us, so to say. The reality of archifossils or objects of ancestral statements is no different from the reality of objects contemporary to us, and this is because neither the former nor the latter are correlates of our thinking, but instead objective correlates of the emergence of a break in the reality as homogeneous continuum, which is precisely the break of modern science, as well as for Lacan already the break of the emergence of the signifier as such. And just a brief reference to the previous discussion, this break of science is precisely the break for Lacan of desexualization of the universe. It's not, I mean, this is very much related. For him, here the story of there is no sexual relationship starts. I mean, before everything was sexual, and the point of psychoanalysis is not that everything is sexual, it's precisely that sexual is the problem. But anyway, this is the point when the sense, the meaning of nature in all these aspects, it's completely erased and something else emerges in this cut, which at the same time produces both the real and the subject. And to repeat, it's not that subject constitutes this real. So I think this is the very reason why Lacan's theory is indeed dialectically materialist. The break here, this break implies nothing else but a speculative identity of the absolute and of becoming. They are not opposed, but need to be taught together. Something can, in time, become absolute as timeless. This is not some kind of unding. The absolute is, at the same time, we could also put it this way, necessary and contingent. There is no absolute without a break in which it is constituted as absolute. One could also say as necessarily necessary, whereby this redoubling is precisely the space in which discourse has consequences. Yet this break is itself contingent. And as you can see here in relationship to Meillassoux, contrary to this, what I said, Meillassoux' gesture of absolutizing the contingency as the only necessity ultimately succumbs, because this is his basic argument that everything is contingent. All basic laws of nature can, without any higher or other reason, change at any time. There is only one exception to this contingency, which is that this contingency itself is an absolute necessity. So this is how he argues this. So I think that by doing this, what he does is actually, one could put it this way, he absolutizes the absent cause, so to say. The cause which, if present, would ground the necessity of the laws such as they are. And his argument in this respect is, of course, a kind of a foundation of atheism. Also, I think he sees it clearly this way, because the way he formulates is that there is absolutely no higher reason, no higher necessity for laws being such as they are. No higher necessity. Therefore, they can change at any moment and so on. But I think perhaps you can see what actually happens here. We get an atheist structure which cannot do without the absolutization of the absent cause, which thus guarantees the contingence of all laws. Or perhaps we can say we are dealing with something like a God of atheists, a God guaranteeing that there is no God. In the conception that I'm kind of trying to draw up with the help of Lacan, the configuration is in fact different. The Lacanian atheism can only be the atheism of the absence of any guarantee. This is precisely why it's often taught as more ambiguous, but the absence, more precisely the absence of any external or meta guarantee. If anything, the guarantee is included into, is part of what it guarantees. There is no independent guarantee, which is not to say that there is no guarantee. And of course, this is the whole where the whole notion of the not all springs from, as different precisely from the notion of constitutive exceptions, which grounds found some kind of totality. That which can disprove one discursive theory and confirm another comes from within the discursive field itself. And perhaps, I don't know, in science, I guess this simply means that an experiment confirms or disqualifies a certain theoretical configuration within the framework of which it takes place. An experiment can only confirm or reject a theory by being performed on its ground. There is nothing simply outside with which it can be measured. So instead of the logic of exception and of meta level, which totalizes some all is contingent, but the necessity of this contingency, we are dealing with the logic of the not all. And Lacan's axiom, which I would write like something like the necessary is not all, precisely not the contingency is absolute or necessary, but more like the necessary is not all. This axiom does not absolutize contingency. I think what it does is something slightly different, or perhaps very different. Namely, it posits it as a point of truth, precisely, of the absolute necessity in it becoming such at some point in time. It's absolute necessity. So the truth is a kind of a dislocated, precisely center of this process. And this now, and I will finish here, this kind of brings us to the crucial point of difference or disaccord between psychoanalysis and science, precisely the question of truth, and what does it do here? Which Lacan keeps relating to the question of truth from this article, famous one, Science and Truth on, at least. And perhaps quickly put, one could say what science does not see or doesn't want to know anything about is the fact that one of the consequences of the discourse is also the effect of truth. The truth as objective dimension of discourse, not objective truth about but truth as objective, precisely dimension of discourse. Not the truth about a given configuration, but truth as irreducible element of this configuration, as an essentially byproduct of the cleavage of the immanence which makes the latter not all. That is to say, which makes it include its own criterion of the real. As an element of a given configuration, the truth can speak only in the first person. You know, this is why Lacan had this idea of the prosopopeia of truth. I, the truth, am speaking. La vérité par le jeu. It's this very strange and strong accent of there is no truth, it's something that speaks, it's not something that is. So, and as we've seen at the end of this last quote from Lacan, this is precisely what interests psychoanalysis. As for us, what interests us is the truth. And this is where another story starts, another chapter of its realism, and where a certain distance in respect to science steps in. And I think it would not be altogether wrong to call this distance precisely political distance. Namely, Lacan explicitly states that with the dimension of truth, there necessarily enters the dimension of conflict. He defines truth as the conflictual element of a given system. This is a definition from this seminar, de notre à l'autre. And the particular seminar in which he states this bears the significant date of November 1968. Of course, it's not at all unrelated to certain events. So I will conclude here today and return to this rather stunning point where the question of truth becomes for Lacan not only a political question, but even the question of political economy in the last part of my lecture tomorrow. Thank you.